In the fluorescent-lit gymnasium of Jefferson High School, a quiet freshman named Lucas Seagal was about to be publicly humiliated. A mandatory self-defense workshop turned deadly serious when Coach Roberts and his classmates mocked Lucas's claim that his grandfather was Steven Seagal, the legendary martial artist and action star. Lucas Seagal wasn't your typical 15-year-old student. For 8 years, he had been training under the watchful eye of Steven Seagal himself, mastering not just physical techniques, but the deeper philosophy of martial arts that emphasized control, wisdom, and inner strength over aggression. When Coach Roberts ridiculed his family's legacy and turned Lucas into the punchline of a joke, he had no idea he was about to face one of the martial world's most respected legends. Steven Seagal would walk through those gymnasium doors with a purpose that would shift the balance of power in the room and trigger a transformation that would revolutionize how an entire school district approached conflict and character education. What began as a routine safety class would become a public reckoning. Jefferson High would never be the same after one student stood his ground and a legend stepped out of the shadows to demonstrate that true martial arts mastery isn't about domination. It's about the wisdom to know when not to fight at all. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the fluorescent-lit gymnasium of Jefferson High, a quiet freshman named Lucas Seagal was about to be publicly humiliated. A simple self-defense workshop turned deadly serious when the instructor, Coach Roberts, mocked Lucas's claim that his grandfather was Steven Seagal, the legendary martial artist and action star. Lucas Seagal wasn't your typical freshman. For 5 years, he'd trained under the watchful eye of his grandfather, learning not just physical techniques, but the deeper philosophy of martial arts. When Coach Roberts ridiculed his family's legacy and turned Lucas into the punchline of a joke, he had no idea he was provoking one of the martial world's quiet legends. The fluorescent lights of Jefferson High's gymnasium buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the blue mats spread across the floor. Lucas sat cross-legged in the back row of students, trying to make himself smaller as Coach Roberts paced in front of them. The self-defense workshop had been mandatory for all freshmen, something about building life skills, but Lucas had been dreading it all week. "All right, people." Coach Roberts' voice boomed through the gym. He was a stocky man with close-cropped hair and a permanent smirk. "Today isn't about looking pretty. It's about staying alive when someone wants to hurt you." A nervous laugh rippled through the 30-something students. Principal Wells, watching from the sidelines with arms crossed, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I've spent 15 years studying combat," Roberts continued, rolling his shoulders. "Was this close to going pro in MMA?" He held his thumb and forefinger a hair's width apart. "So trust me when I say what I'm about to teach. You might save your life someday." In the front row, Jake Matthews snickered to the boy beside him. "My dad says he washed out in the regionals, broke his nose and quit." Coach Roberts shot him a look. "Something to share with the class, Matthews?" "No, sir," Jake mumbled, but his smirk remained. Coach clapped his hands together. "All right, let's start with the basics. The number one rule in any confrontation is awareness," came a quiet voice from the back. Coach Roberts' head snapped up. "Excuse me." Lucas swallowed hard, already regretting speaking. All eyes turned to him. Awareness of your surroundings. That's what my grandpa always said." Coach Roberts' lips curled. "Your grandpa, huh? And what did he do? Work mall security?" A few laughs scattered across the room. Lucas's face flushed, but something inside him, maybe pride, maybe just truth, made him straighten his shoulders. "No, sir. He was a martial artist. He's Steven Seagal." The laughter came louder this time, led by Coach Roberts' barking guffaw. Even Principal Wells covered a smile with her hand. "Steven Seagal?" Coach Roberts repeated, walking toward Lucas with exaggerated steps. "Well, excuse me, everyone. Looks like we've got a celebrity's grandson in our midst." He made a mock bow. "Tell me, Seagal, did your grandpa also train Batman? Maybe taught Bruce Lee a thing or two?" Jake was doubled over now, pointing at Lucas. "His grandpa was a kung fu master." "Hey, Thompson, wait, Seagal, can you do the crane kick?" The room erupted. Even Marissa Adams, who normally stayed quiet, had to duck her head to hide a smile. Lucas felt his throat tighten. His grandfather's stories, told on quiet evenings on the porch, demonstrated in their small backyard, suddenly sounded like childish fantasy, even to his own ears. "It's true," he said, but his voice got lost in the laughter. Coach Roberts wiped an imaginary tear from his eye. "Listen, kid, we all had fantasies growing up. I wanted to be the Undertaker from WWE. My sister thought she was Sailor Moon. But we grew up." He looked around the room, playing to his audience. Seagal here still thinks his grandpa was the action movie star. "What's next? Walker, Texas Ranger came to your birthday parties?" Principal Wells finally stepped forward. "Coach, perhaps we should get back to the lesson." Right. Coach Roberts nodded, still chuckling. "Sorry, Principal Wells. Just making sure we're dealing with reality, not playground fantasies." Lucas stared at the mat beneath him, wishing it would swallow him whole. His grandfather had been gone 3 years now. The stories, the photographs. In the attic, the trophies his mother had packed away. Had they all just been exaggerations? His dad used to say Grandpa was the most honest man he'd ever known. But Dad had been gone even longer, killed in action when Lucas was just 7. "All right, everyone on your feet," Coach barked. "We're going to learn a basic wrist escape. When someone grabs you like this," he snatched Jake's wrist to demonstrate, "you don't pull away. You push into them, then pivot and twist. Simple physics." The students paired off. No one chose Lucas. Eventually, Marissa wandered over, her dark hair pulled back in a sensible ponytail, eyes not quite meeting his. "Partners?" she asked quietly. "Yeah, thanks," Lucas mumbled. As they practiced the move, Marissa glanced at him. "Was any of that true? About your grandfather?" Lucas hesitated. "All of it. He really is Steven Seagal. He had a school in California for years. There are pictures at home of him on movie sets and with other martial artists from the 80s and 90s. Marissa studied him. "Why doesn't anyone know about him being your grandfather?" "He was private. Didn't like attention. Mom says he turned down interviews because he thought fame made martial arts look like it was all about fighting." Lucas attempted the wrist escape, but his heart wasn't in it. "Doesn't matter. No one believes me anyway." "I believe you," she said, but Lucas couldn't tell if she meant it or was just being kind. Coach Roberts stalked between the pairs, occasionally, stopping to correct a stance or demonstrate a move with unnecessary force. When he reached Lucas and Marissa, he smirked. "Show me that escape, Seagal. I'm betting your grandpa taught you some secret ninja moves, right?" The sarcasm dripped from his voice. Before Lucas could respond, the heavy metal doors at the far end of the gymnasium creaked open. A shaft of light spilled across the polished floor as a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. The room fell quiet. That strange, unified hush that happens when 30 people notice something extraordinary at the same moment. The walk home from Jefferson High felt like a march of shame. Lucas kept his head down, earbuds in, trying to drown out the echoes of laughter that seemed to follow him down every street. His backpack felt heavier than usual, weighed down not by books, but by humiliation. He pushed through the front door of his modest 2-story house, the familiar scent of his mother's lavender candles doing little to comfort him. She was at work, double shift at the hospital again, which meant he had the house to himself to process what had happened. Lucas climbed the stairs to his room, each step feeling like a small defeat. His bedroom walls were covered with martial arts posters and photographs, some showing him with his grandfather, others displaying various certificates and awards from local tournaments. In the corner sat a wooden dummy, its arms worn smooth from years of practice. He dropped his backpack and stared at himself in the mirror above his dresser. The face looking back was his grandfather's, the same dark eyes, the same strong jawline, though Lucas's was still soft with youth. But where? His grandfather carried himself with quiet confidence. Lucas saw only doubt. "Maybe they're right," he whispered to his reflection. "Maybe I'm just living in a fantasy." But even as he said it, the words felt wrong. Lucas walked to his closet and pulled out a shoebox from the top shelf. Inside were photographs, newspaper, clippings, and a few DVDs. His grandfather's life, carefully preserved by his mother. He picked up a photo of Steven Seagal from the 1980s, long black hair, intense stare, wearing a traditional GI. On the back, in his grandfather's careful handwriting, "To my grandson Lucas. True strength comes from within. Never forget who you are." Lucas sank onto his bed, holding the photograph. He remembered the day his grandfather had given it to him, just a few months before the cancer took him. They'd been in the backyard, practicing forms under the old oak tree. Lucas, his grandfather had said, his voice already weakened by illness. People will doubt you. They'll say things that aren't true. But you know what's real. You know what I've taught you. The old man had moved slowly, demonstrating a simple blocking technique. This isn't about fame or movies or what people think they know. This is about balance. About understanding yourself and your place in the world. Lucas had been only 12 then, more interested in the physical aspects of training than the philosophy. Now, sitting in his room 3 years later, he finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to tell him. He stood up and walked to the wooden dummy, placing his hands on its worn surface. His grandfather had built this for him, teaching him the proper way to condition his hands and practice techniques. Every mark, every smooth spot, told a story of hours spent learning. Lucas closed his eyes and began to move through the forms his grandfather had taught him. Slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, flowing from one to the next like water. This wasn't the aggressive, flashy martial arts Coach Roberts had been teaching. This was something deeper, a meditation in motion. As he practiced, Lucas could almost hear his grandfather's voice. Don't fight the world, Lucas. Move with it. Redirect its energy. True power isn't about forcing your will on others. It's about understanding when not to fight at all. The shame from the day began to fade, replaced by something stronger. His grandfather hadn't raised him to seek validation from others. He'd taught him to find strength within himself, to stand firm in his convictions even when the world doubted him. Lucas opened his eyes and looked at the photograph again. Steven Seagal stared back, not with the hardened expression of an action hero, but with the calm, knowing eyes of a teacher. A grandfather who had seen beyond the Hollywood facade to teach his grandson what really mattered. I know who I am, Lucas said aloud, his voice stronger now. I know what you taught me. He carefully placed the photograph back in the box, but not before looking at another picture. This one of him and his grandfather from just 2 years ago, both in white GIs, both smiling. His grandfather's hand rested on Lucas's shoulder, and even in the photo, you could see the pride in the old man's eyes. Lucas changed into his practice clothes and went to the backyard. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the oak tree, casting dancing shadows on the grass. This was where he'd learned to truly understand martial arts. Not in a gym with fluorescent lights and jeering classmates, but in the quiet sanctuary of his own backyard. He began his forms again, this time with complete focus. Each movement was a conversation with his grandfather's memory, each technique a reminder of the lessons that went far beyond physical combat. Control, balance, humility, the strength to stand alone when necessary. By the time he finished, Lucas felt centered again. The laughter from the gymnasium seemed distant now, unimportant. He had something his classmates didn't understand, a connection to something real, something that had been passed down through years of patient teaching. Tomorrow would bring another day at school, another opportunity to face the doubts and mockery. But tonight, Lucas Seagal knew exactly who he was and where he came from. And that knowledge was stronger than any ridicule. As he walked back toward the house, Lucas didn't know that his grandfather had been watching the news, had heard about the incident at Jefferson High from a concerned Principal Wells who had recognized the name. Steven Seagal was already making plans to pay his grandson a visit. Some lessons, after all, were best taught in person. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray sky that matched Lucas's mood. He'd spent the evening practicing forms in his backyard, finding some peace in the familiar movements his grandfather had taught him. But now, facing another day at Jefferson High, the doubt crept back in like morning fog. Lucas dressed slowly, pulling on his worn jeans and a simple black t-shirt. He caught his reflection in the mirror, his grandfather's eyes looking back at him, but still filled with uncertainty. The photograph from the shoebox sat on his dresser, Steven Seagal's calm gaze seeming to offer silent encouragement. You know what's real, Lucas whispered to himself, repeating his grandfather's words. You know what I've taught you. The hallways of Jefferson High buzzed with the usual morning energy. Lucas kept his head down, navigating through clusters of students toward his locker. He could hear whispers as he passed. Word of yesterday's incident had spread, as it always did in high school. That's the kid who thinks Steven Seagal is his grandpa, someone snickered. Yeah. Next he'll say Jackie Chan is his uncle, another voice added. Lucas's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. Marissa caught up with him at his locker, her expression sympathetic. You okay? She asked quietly. Lucas shrugged, spinning his combination lock. Same as always. You don't have to prove anything to them, you know, she said. Some people just can't handle the truth when it's bigger than their world. Before Lucas could respond, the bell rang, signaling the start of another day. They walked together toward the gymnasium, where Coach Roberts was already setting up for the continuation of the self-defense workshop. All right, settle down. Coach Roberts barked as the students filed in. Yesterday, we covered basic escapes. Today, we're moving on to defensive stances and counterattacks. His eyes found Lucas in the crowd, and we're going to stick to reality-based techniques, not movie magic. A few students chuckled, and Lucas felt his cheeks burn. He took his usual spot in the back, trying to become invisible. Coach Roberts began demonstrating a basic fighting stance, his movements sharp and aggressive. In a real confrontation, you need to be ready to strike first and strike hard. None of this peaceful warrior nonsense you see in films. Lucas watched, his grandfather's teachings echoing in his mind. This wasn't wrong, exactly, but it was incomplete. His grandfather had taught him that true martial arts began with avoiding conflict, not initiating it. The key is intimidation, Coach Roberts continued. Make yourself look bigger, more threatening. Sometimes that's enough to end a fight before it starts. What about de-escalation? Lucas heard himself asking before he could stop. The gym fell silent. Coach Roberts turned slowly, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. Excuse me, Seagal. Lucas swallowed hard but didn't back down. My grandfather taught me that the first rule of martial arts is to avoid fighting altogether. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away. Coach Roberts' face darkened. Your grandfather, right? The famous Steven Seagal. He turned to address the class. Let me tell you something about the real world, kid. When someone wants to hurt you, they don't care about your philosophy. They care about results. But, Lucas began. No buts. Coach Roberts cut him off. This is about survival, not some fantasy your grandfather filled your head with. In the real world, hesitation gets you hurt. The gymnasium fell into uncomfortable silence. Lucas felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on him, most filled with amusement or pity. Jake Matthews was grinning openly, clearly enjoying the show. And then, for the second time in 2 days, the heavy metal doors at the far end of the gymnasium creaked open. This time, there was no mistaking the figure that stepped through. Tall, imposing, with long dark hair now touched with silver, Steven Seagal walked into Jefferson High's gymnasium with the same quiet confidence he'd carried through decades of films and martial arts demonstrations. The effect was immediate and complete. Every conversation stopped. Every snicker died in someone's throat. Even Coach Roberts' mouth fell open in stunned silence. Steven Seagal moved with the fluid grace of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of controlled movement. He wore simple black clothing, jeans, and a long-sleeved shirt, but his presence filled the room like a force of nature. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. His eyes found Lucas immediately, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. I heard my grandson was having some difficulty in class. Principal Wells, who had been observing from the sidelines, hurried forward. Mr. Seagal, we weren't expecting. I was in the area, Steven said simply, though Lucas suspected that wasn't entirely true. I thought I'd stop by and see how Lucas was doing with his studies. Coach Roberts had gone pale, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. You're really Steven Seagal, the man confirmed with a slight nod. And you must be Coach Roberts. I understand you've been teaching my grandson about self-defense. The way he said it, calm, measured, without a hint of accusation, somehow made it sound like the most loaded statement in the world. Lucas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This was really happening. His grandfather, the man who had taught him everything about martial arts, the legend that no one believed existed in his life, was standing in his high school gymnasium. Coach Roberts began, then stopped, clearly at a loss for words. Demonstrating aggressive techniques, Steven finished calmly. I heard. May I? He gestured toward the center of the mat. Coach Roberts nodded mutely, stepping aside. Steven Seagal moved to the center of the gymnasium, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. He looked around at the assembled students, his gaze lingering on Jake Matthews, who had gone from smirking to staring in open-mouthed disbelief. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lucas, Steven said quietly, would you join me? Lucas felt his legs shaking as he stood up. Every eye in the room was on him as he walked to the center of the mat. But for the first time in 2 days, he wasn't afraid. His grandfather was. Here, the man who had taught him everything about strength and control was standing beside him. Class, Steven said, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the room. Today you're going to learn what martial arts is really about. The gymnasium had become a cathedral of silence. 30 students sat transfixed as Steven Seagal stood in the center of the mat, his grandson beside him. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz more quietly, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Lucas, Steven said softly, placing a gentle hand on his grandson's shoulder. Show them the wrist escape we practiced. Lucas felt his mouth go dry. Grandpa, I don't know if you know it, Steven interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades teaching. Trust yourself. Steven extended his hand, and Lucas grasped it in the basic grip Coach Roberts had demonstrated the day before. But where Coach Roberts' technique had been about force and aggression, Steven's approach was entirely different. The mistake most people make, Steven said, addressing the class while maintaining the grip, is thinking that martial arts is about overpowering your opponent. But true martial arts is about understanding energy, yours and theirs. He nodded to Lucas, who began the escape. But instead of the jerky, forceful movement Coach Roberts had taught, Lucas moved with fluid precision. He didn't pull away from his grandfather's grip. He moved into it, redirecting the energy, finding the natural weakness in the hold. The escape was so smooth, so effortless, that several students leaned forward to see if Steven had simply let go. But Lucas knew better. His grandfather's grip had been real, solid, and the escape had worked exactly as it was supposed to. Beautiful, Steven said, and Lucas felt a warmth spread through his chest. Do you see the difference? He turned to Coach Roberts, who was watching with a mixture of fascination and embarrassment. Coach, would you mind demonstrating your version? Coach Roberts hesitated, then stepped forward. He grabbed Lucas's wrist with his usual aggressive grip, muscles tense, jaw set. Lucas attempted the escape as Roberts had taught it, pulling away, using brute force against brute force. It worked, but it was clumsy, requiring significant effort and leaving both participants off balance. Both techniques work, Steven said, diplomatically, but one requires strength, while the other requires understanding. Which do you think is more reliable when you're facing someone bigger and stronger than you? The question hung in the air. Jake Matthews, who had been Lucas's primary tormentor, raised his hand hesitantly. The understanding one, he ventured. Steven nodded. Exactly. Physical strength has limits. Understanding has none. He turned to address the entire class. My grandson has been studying martial arts since he was 7 years old. Not because I wanted him to be a fighter, but because I wanted him to understand that true strength comes from within. Marissa raised her hand. Mr. Seagal, could you show us more? Steven smiled, and Lucas saw a hint of the man who had entertained millions in action films. Of course. But first, let me explain something important. Everything you see in movies, the flashy kicks, the dramatic fights, that's entertainment. Real martial arts is about ending conflicts, not starting them. He gestured to Coach Roberts. Coach, would you mind assisting? I promise you won't be hurt. Coach Roberts approached warily. Steven positioned himself casually, hands at his sides, completely relaxed. Try to grab me, he said simply. Coach Roberts reached out, but before his hand could make contact, Steven moved. It wasn't fast, there was no dramatic speed involved, but it was so perfectly timed, so precisely executed, that Coach Roberts found himself grasping empty air while Steven stood exactly where he had been. Again, Steven said calmly. Coach. Roberts tried again, this time with more determination. The result was the same, a subtle shift, a slight movement, and Roberts was off balance while Steven remained centered. The principle is called ireme, Steven explained. Entering. Instead of meeting force with force, you enter the attack, redirect the energy, and control the outcome. He demonstrated several more techniques, each one flowing seamlessly into the next. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary force. Every movement had purpose. Every technique served a greater strategy. Lucas watched in amazement. He'd seen his grandfather practice countless times, but never in front of an audience like this. The man who had taught him in their quiet backyard was the same legend who had filled movie screens around the world. "Lucas," Steven said, "show them the form I taught you last summer." Lucas's heart raced. The form was complex, requiring perfect balance and coordination. He'd never performed it in front of anyone except his grandfather. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Steven said simply. "Trust your training." Lucas took a deep breath and began. The form started slowly, with simple movements that gradually increased in complexity. Each technique flowed into the next, creating a seamless demonstration of martial arts principles. As he moved, Lucas felt something click into place. The gymnasium faded away, the watching students disappeared, and there was only the movement, the breath, the perfect balance between force and control that his grandfather had spent years teaching him. When he finished, the silence was different. Not the awkward quiet of yesterday's mockery, but the respectful hush of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. "That," Steven said, his voice filled with pride, "is what martial arts looks like. Not the angry, aggressive fighting you see in movies, but the controlled, purposeful movement of someone who understands their own power." He turned to Coach Roberts. "You teach valuable skills, Coach. Physical fitness, basic self-defense, confidence. But may I suggest that you consider adding this element to your curriculum? The understanding that true strength comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when not to." Coach Roberts nodded, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine respect. I'd like to learn more about this approach." "I'd be happy to discuss it with you," Steven said. "But first, I think my grandson has something to say." All eyes turned to Lucas, who stood a little straighter than he had in days. The boy who had been mocked and ridiculed was gone, replaced by a young man who finally understood his place in the world. "My grandfather didn't teach me martial arts to make me tough," Lucas said, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. "He taught me so I'd know who I am. So I'd understand that real strength isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about being true to yourself." The gymnasium erupted in applause, led by Marissa and, surprisingly, by Jake Matthews. Even Coach Roberts was clapping, his face showing a mixture of admiration and newfound respect. Steven Seagal put his arm around his grandson's shoulders, and Lucas felt the weight of 3 years of grief and doubt finally lift from his chest. His grandfather was here, and he was proud. The legend was real. The teachings were real. And Lucas Seagal was finally ready to claim his place in both. The applause had died down, but the energy in the gymnasium remained electric. Students who had been snickering at Lucas just minutes before now looked at him with genuine respect. Steven Seagal's presence had transformed the atmosphere completely, but Lucas could see that Coach Roberts was struggling with the shift in dynamics. The coach stood at the edge of the mat, his jaw working silently as he watched Steven interact with the students. Several kids had approached with questions about martial arts, and Steven answered each one with patience and wisdom. But Lucas noticed the way Coach Roberts' hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the way his eyes tracked every movement his grandfather made. "Mr. Seagal," Coach Roberts finally said, his voice carrying across the gymnasium with forced casualness. "That was impressive. But I have to ask, in a real street fight, would all that philosophical stuff actually work?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Steven turned slowly, his expression unchanged, but Lucas caught the slight tightening around his grandfather's eyes. The old man had dealt with skeptics before. "That's a fair question, Coach," Steven said evenly. "Would you like to find out?" Principal Wells stepped forward, alarm evident on her face. "Gentlemen, I don't think. It's fine," Steven said, raising a calming hand. "The coach has a legitimate concern. If I'm going to suggest changes to his curriculum, he should understand what he's considering." Coach Roberts' chest puffed out slightly. "I've been teaching combat sports for 15 years. I've seen what works and what doesn't. With respect, Mr. Seagal, Movie fighting isn't the same as real fighting. You're absolutely right, Steven agreed, and Lucas saw several students exchange surprised glances. Movies are entertainment. They have nothing to do with real martial arts. He stepped onto the mat, his movements fluid and purposeful. But you seem to think that real martial arts is about aggression, about dominating your opponent. May I show you a different perspective? Coach Roberts hesitated, then nodded. Curtly, sure, but let's make it realistic. In a real fight, someone's coming at you with bad intentions. They're not going to politely extend their hand for a wrist escape. I agree completely, Steven said. Lucas, would you step back with the others, please? Lucas reluctantly joined, his classmates at the edge of the mat. Marissa grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with concern. Is your grandfather really going to fight Coach Roberts? She whispered. He's not going to fight, Lucas said, though his own heart was racing. He's going to teach. Steven and Coach Roberts faced each other on the mat. The difference between them was immediately apparent. Roberts was coiled like a spring, muscles tense, hands raised in a traditional fighting stance. Steven stood relaxed, hands at his sides, breathing calmly. The scenario, Steven said to the watching students, is that Coach Roberts is an attacker. He's going to try to grab me, strike me, or otherwise use his superior size and strength to control me. I'm going to demonstrate why understanding matters more than aggression. Coach Roberts nodded grimly. And I'm going to show these kids what happens when philosophy meets reality. He lunged forward, reaching for Steven's shirt collar with his left hand while drawing back his right fist. It was a classic street fighting move, grab and strike, using size advantage to overwhelm the opponent. What happened next was so subtle that several students missed it entirely. Steven shifted slightly to his right, his left hand rising to meet Roberts's grabbing arm. But instead of blocking the attack, Steven's hand guided it, redirecting the coach's momentum while simultaneously stepping into the space Roberts had vacated. The result was that Coach Roberts found himself off balance. His intended grab turned into an awkward stumble that left him vulnerable. Steven's right hand came up, not to strike, but to lightly tap the coach's exposed ribs. Stop, Steven said quietly. Coach Roberts froze, suddenly aware of how completely his attack had been neutralized. He was bent forward, off balance, with Steven's hand resting gently against his side. If Steven had wanted to strike, the coach would have been helpless to prevent it. That was, how did you? Roberts straightened slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. Try again, Steven said calmly. This time, use your wrestling background. Come in low, go for the takedown. Coach Roberts' eyes narrowed. This was more his element, ground fighting, using his weight and strength advantage. He dropped his center of gravity and shot forward, arms extended to wrap around Steven's waist. Again, Steven's response was minimal but devastating. A slight pivot, a subtle shift of weight, and suddenly Coach Roberts was grasping empty air while Steven stood. Behind him, one hand resting lightly on the back of his neck. Control, Steven said simply. Not aggression, not domination. Control. He stepped back, allowing Coach Roberts to straighten up. The coach was breathing hard, more from frustration than exertion. One more time, Roberts said, his voice tight. Full contact. No holding back. Principal Wells started to object, but Steven nodded. If that's what you need to understand, coach. But remember, this isn't about winning or losing. It's about learning. Coach Roberts set his stance, this time with the focused intensity of a serious competitor. Lucas could see the shift in his posture, the way his breathing changed. This wasn't going to be another demonstration. This was going to be a real test. Roberts came forward with a combination, a feint with his left hand followed by a hard right cross, then immediately dropping for a leg takedown. It was fast, coordinated, and would have been effective against most opponents. Steven's response was like watching water flow around a stone. He absorbed the feint without reacting, slipped the cross by millimeters, and when Roberts dropped for the takedown, Steven's hands were there to guide him past, using the coach's own momentum against him. But this time, instead of simply demonstrating control, Steven followed through. As Roberts stumbled past, Steven's hands found specific pressure points on the coach's arm and shoulder. Roberts gasped, his arm going numb, and suddenly found himself on the mat with Steven kneeling beside him, one hand maintaining gentle but absolute control. The difference, Steven said, his voice carrying clearly to every student in the gymnasium, is that aggression seeks to impose will through force. Understanding seeks to redirect force through knowledge. He released the pressure points, and Coach Roberts' arm tingled back to life. Steven helped him to his feet, his expression showing no triumph, no satisfaction in having bested the younger man. "You have excellent technique, Coach," Steven said respectfully. "Your students are lucky to have someone with your experience. But consider this. What if instead of teaching them to be better fighters, we taught them to be better than fighting?" Coach Roberts stood there for a long moment, rubbing his arm where Steven had applied the pressure. Lucas could see the wheels turning in his mind, the grudging respect growing alongside his wounded pride. I need to think about this," he said finally. "Of course," Steven nodded. "Change is never easy, but growth requires us to question what we think we know." He turned to the assembled students. "What you just witnessed wasn't about me being better than your coach. It was about demonstrating that there are always alternatives to conflict. The goal of martial arts isn't to win fights, it's to avoid them. And when you can't avoid them, to end them as quickly and safely as possible." Jake Matthews raised his hand tentatively. "Mr. Seagal, could you teach us some of those moves?" Steven smiled. "I could teach you the physical techniques in an afternoon, but the understanding that makes them effective? That takes years to develop. And it starts with something much more important than fighting." "What's that?" several students asked almost simultaneously. "Knowing who you are," Steven said, his eyes finding Lucas in the crowd, "and being comfortable with that knowledge, regardless of what others think." The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but no one moved. The students sat transfixed, still processing what they had witnessed. Coach Roberts stood quietly at the edge of the mat, his expression thoughtful. "That's all for today," Principal Wells finally announced. "Mr. Seagal, perhaps you'd join me in my office? I'd like to discuss the possibility of you speaking to more of our students." As the students reluctantly began to file out, Lucas remained on the mat with his grandfather. The gymnasium was nearly empty when Coach Roberts approached them. "Mr. Seagal," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. And I owe your grandson an apology too. I was wrong about a lot of things." Steven clasped the coach's shoulder. "You weren't wrong, Coach. You were incomplete. There's a difference." Coach Roberts nodded slowly. Would you consider working with me? Maybe we could develop a program that combines your philosophy with practical application?" "I'd be honored," Steven said. "But the real teacher is standing right here." He indicated Lucas. "My grandson understands these principles better than most adults. Perhaps he could assist you." Lucas felt a warm surge of pride, but also a flicker of uncertainty. "Teaching others? Him? I don't know if I'm ready for that," he said quietly. "You're ready," Steven said simply. "You've been ready for a long time. You just needed to believe it." The gymnasium had emptied except for Lucas, Steven, and Coach Roberts, who was gathering his equipment with thoughtful slowness. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the mats where Lucas had just witnessed his grandfather demonstrate the principles he'd been learning for years. "Walk with me," Steven said quietly to Lucas, nodding toward the exit. "I think we need to talk." They made their way through the school's corridors, past lockers and bulletin boards covered with announcements about upcoming events. Students heading to their next classes stopped to stare as they recognized Steven Seagal walking through their hallways, but he paid them no attention, his focus entirely on his grandson. They found a quiet spot in the courtyard behind the school, where a few weathered picnic tables sat under the shade of old maple trees. Steven settled onto one of the benches, and Lucas sat across from him, still processing everything that had happened. "You're troubled," Steven observed, his dark eyes studying Lucas's face with the intensity of a man who had spent years reading people's intentions. Lucas looked down at his hands. "I don't understand what just happened in there. Everyone was laughing at me yesterday, calling me a liar. And now suddenly they all want to learn from me. And that bothers you. It feels fake somehow, like they only respect me now because of who you are, not because of who I am." Lucas's voice carried a note of frustration. "Yesterday I was nobody. Today I'm the grandson of Steven Seagal. But I'm the same person I was yesterday." Steven nodded slowly. "You're right. You are the same person. But they're not the same people who were laughing at you." "What do you mean?" "They've learned something about themselves, Lucas. They've learned that their assumptions were wrong. That's not comfortable for most people. It forces them to question what else they might be wrong about. Lucas picked at the weathered wood of the picnic table. I wanted them to respect me for what I could do, not for who I'm related to. And what can you do? The question caught Lucas off guard. I don't know. I mean, I can do the forms you taught me. I understand the principles. But I'm not you, Grandpa. I'm not some legendary martial artist. Stephen was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the maple trees swaying in the breeze. When he spoke, his voice was softer than Lucas had ever heard it. When I was your age, I felt the same way. I had teachers who were giants in my eyes, men who had devoted their entire lives to understanding the warrior's path. I thought I'd never measure up to them, that I'd always be just a student, never a master. Lucas looked up, surprised. He'd never heard his grandfather express doubt about anything. But then I realized I was asking the wrong question. I wasn't supposed to become my teachers. I was supposed to become myself, using what they had taught me as a foundation. I don't understand. Stephen leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. Lucas, what did you feel when you were demonstrating that form in the gymnasium? Lucas thought back to those moments on the mat, when the watching students had faded away and there was only the movement, the breath, the perfect balance between force and control. I felt peaceful, like everything made sense, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And who were you in that moment? I was. Lucas paused, searching for the words. I was me, just me, not trying to prove anything to anyone, not worried about what they thought, just doing what I'd been taught to do. Exactly. Steven's voice carried a note of satisfaction. In that moment, you weren't Steven Seagal's grandson. You weren't trying to live up to anyone's expectations. You were simply Lucas, demonstrating the principles you've spent years learning. Lucas felt something shift inside him, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. But people still only respect me because of you. Do they? Stephen asked. Coach Roberts wants you to help him develop a new curriculum. Do you think that's because of me, or because he saw something in you that he hadn't noticed before? Lucas considered this. Coach Roberts had been watching him perform the form, had seen the precision and control that came from years of practice. And the coach's request hadn't been for Stephen to teach. It had been for Lucas to assist. I hadn't thought about it that way. Your classmates saw you demonstrate mastery of something they didn't understand. They saw you move with confidence and skill. Yes, my presence gave them context for what they were seeing, but what they were seeing was you, Lucas. Your training, your dedication, your understanding. A group of students walked past the courtyard, and Lucas could hear them talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed in the gymnasium. One of them mentioned his name, and Lucas was surprised to realize they weren't talking about Steven Seagal's grandson. They were talking about Lucas and the incredible form he'd performed. I've been so focused on proving myself that I forgot who I was, Lucas said quietly. It's a common mistake, Steven said. We get so caught up in how others see us that we lose sight of how we see ourselves. But true confidence doesn't come from external validation. It comes from internal alignment. What do you mean? When your actions align with your values, when your behavior reflects your true nature, when you're being authentic rather than trying to be impressive, that's when you find real confidence. That's when you discover who you really are. Lucas looked out across the courtyard, watching other students go about their day. Yesterday, he would have envied their easy confidence, their certainty about their place in the world. Today, he realized that confidence wasn't something you could fake or borrow. It was something you built through consistent action aligned with your deepest values. I keep thinking about what you said in there, Lucas said, about knowing who you are. I thought I knew, but now I'm not so sure. Stephen smiled. That's the beginning of wisdom, Lucas. The moment you think you have all the answers is the moment you stop growing. Real self-knowledge is a lifelong journey, not a destination. So how do I figure out who I am? You already know more than you think. Tell me, what matters most to you? Lucas thought about the question seriously. I don't like seeing people get hurt. I don't like bullies. I want to help people feel safe and confident, the way you help me feel safe and confident. And what are you good at? I'm good at listening. I'm good at understanding how people feel. And I'm good at the martial arts you taught me, not just the physical techniques, but the philosophy behind them. Stephen nodded approvingly. And if you could spend your life doing something that combined those things, helping people, using your understanding of martial arts philosophy, making people feel safe. Would that feel like a meaningful life to you? Lucas felt a spark of excitement. Yeah, it would. Then you already know who you are, Lucas. You're someone who wants to help others find their own strength. Someone who understands that true martial arts is about building people up, not tearing them down. Someone who has the knowledge and the character to make a real difference. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the late afternoon shadows lengthen across the courtyard. Lucas felt a sense of peace settling over him, different from the anxious energy he'd carried for so long. "Grandpa," he said finally, "I'm sorry I doubted what you taught me. I'm sorry I let other people's opinions matter more than my own understanding." Steven reached across the table and clasped his grandson's hand. "Never apologize for being human, Lucas. Doubt is part of growth. The important thing is that you found your way back to your truth. What happens now? Now you live your life according to your own values, not other people's expectations. You help Coach Roberts develop his program. You share what you know with your classmates. You continue to learn and grow. And you remember that being Steven Seagal's grandson is just one part of who you are, not the most important part." Lucas squeezed his grandfather's hand. "What's the most important part?" Steven's eyes crinkled with warmth. "Being Lucas. Just Lucas. That's more than enough." As they walked back toward the school building, Lucas felt lighter than he had in years. He finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all along. That true strength came not from proving yourself to others, but from being true to yourself. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Seagal knew exactly who that self was. Word of Steven Seagal's visit to Jefferson High spread through the school like wildfire. By the next morning, Lucas found himself at the center of attention in a way that felt completely different from the mockery he'd endured just days before. Students approached him in the hallways with genuine curiosity, asking about his training, his grandfather's teachings, and whether the rumors about a special demonstration were true. Principal Wells had spent the evening making phone calls, and by Tuesday morning, she had secured permission from the district office for something unprecedented: a school-wide assembly featuring Steven Seagal and Lucas demonstrating traditional martial arts principles. "I've never seen anything like it," Principal Wells told Lucas as she walked him to her office during lunch period. The district superintendent personally approved this. "Apparently, Mr. Henderson has been looking for ways to integrate character education into our curriculum, and your grandfather's philosophy aligns perfectly with our goals." Lucas felt his stomach tighten with nervous energy. "How many people are we talking about?" "The entire school. About 800 students, plus faculty." She noticed his expression and paused. "Lucas, you don't have to do this if you're not comfortable. Your grandfather made it clear that this is your choice." Lucas thought about his conversation with Steven the day before, about being true to himself and living according to his own values. The idea of performing in front of 800 people terrified him, but it also felt right. This was an opportunity to share something meaningful, to help others understand what his grandfather had spent years teaching him. "I want to do it," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "I want to show them what real martial arts looks like." The assembly was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Lucas spent Wednesday evening in his backyard with Steven, practicing forms and discussing the philosophical principles they would demonstrate. His grandfather's approach was characteristically calm and methodical. "Remember," Steven said as they moved through a series of flowing techniques, "this isn't a performance. It's a teaching moment. The goal isn't to impress anyone. It's to plant seeds of understanding that might grow into wisdom." Lucas nodded, focusing on his breathing as he transitioned from one movement to the next. "What if I mess up? What if I freeze in front of all those people?" "Then you'll be human," Steven replied simply. "And that might be the most important lesson of all. Perfection isn't the goal, Lucas. Authenticity is." Thursday arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt like a blessing. Lucas dressed carefully in his white GI, the one his grandfather had given him for his 15th birthday. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw not a nervous freshman trying to prove himself, but a young martial artist ready to share something he loved. The gymnasium had been transformed for the assembly. Portable bleachers had been brought in to accommodate the entire student body, and a large mat area had been set up in the center of the floor. As Lucas and Steven entered through the side door, the buzz of 800 conversations gradually died to an expectant silence. Principal Wells introduced them with obvious pride. Today we're privileged to have with us a true legend, not just in martial arts, but in the entertainment industry, Steven Seagal. More importantly, we have one of our own students, Lucas Seagal, who will be demonstrating the principles his grandfather has taught him. The applause was thunderous, but Lucas barely heard it. His focus was entirely on the mat, on the space where he would soon be demonstrating years of training and discipline. As they walked to the center of the gymnasium, Steven leaned close to his ear. "Just breathe, Lucas. Trust your training. Trust yourself." Steven addressed the assembly first, his voice carrying easily through the gymnasium without amplification. When most people think of martial arts, they think of fighting. They think of violence and aggression. But true martial arts is about something much deeper. It's about understanding yourself and your place in the world. He gestured to Lucas, who stood calmly beside him. "My grandson has been studying these principles since he was 7 years old. Today, he's going to show you what real martial arts looks like. Not the flashy moves you see in movies, but the quiet strength that comes from years of dedicated practice." Lucas stepped forward, and suddenly the gymnasium felt smaller, more intimate. 800 faces looked back at him, but instead of judgment, he saw curiosity. Instead of mockery, he saw genuine interest. "Martial arts taught me that strength isn't about being able to hurt people," Lucas said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It's about being able to protect them. It's about having the control to choose not to fight, even when you could win." He began with a simple form, movements flowing like water, each technique demonstrating perfect balance and control. As he moved, Lucas felt the same peace he'd experienced in the previous demonstration, the sense of being exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The assembly watched in complete silence as Lucas demonstrated principle after principle: control over aggression, redirection over force, understanding over emotion. With each movement, he could see minds opening, perspectives shifting. When he finished, the applause was different from what he'd heard before. It wasn't the polite clapping of a captive audience, but the genuine appreciation of people who had witnessed something meaningful. Marissa was beaming from the front row. Jake Matthews was on his feet, clapping enthusiastically. Even Coach Roberts, standing with the other faculty members, wore an expression of profound respect. But the moment that would stay with Lucas forever came when a small freshman girl raised her hand during the question period. "Lucas," she asked in a quiet voice that somehow carried through the gymnasium, "I get picked on a lot because I'm different. Could martial arts help me feel stronger inside, even if I'm not stronger on the outside?" Lucas looked at his grandfather, who nodded encouragingly, then back at the girl. In her question, he heard echoes of his own struggles, his own search for inner strength. "Yes," he said simply. "That's exactly what it's for. Martial arts isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more yourself, more confident, more centered, more comfortable with who you are." The assembly ended with a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. As students filed out, many stopped to thank Lucas personally, to ask about training opportunities, to share their own stories of feeling different or misunderstood. Walking home that afternoon, Lucas felt a profound sense of completion. He had faced his fears, shared his knowledge, and helped others understand something that mattered deeply to him. For the first time in his life, he felt truly proud of who he was, not as Steven Seagal's grandson, but as Lucas Seagal, teacher and student, warrior and philosopher. "How do you feel?" Steven asked as they reached Lucas's front door. Lucas thought for a moment, then smiled. "I feel like myself. Finally, completely like myself." His grandfather's answering smile told him everything he needed to know. The student had become the teacher, and the legacy would continue. The energy in Jefferson High was electric the following week. Word of the assembly had spread beyond the school grounds, and Lucas found himself at the center of something he'd never expected: a genuine movement toward understanding what martial arts could really offer young people. Coach Roberts had approached him Monday morning with a proposal that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. "Lucas, I've been thinking about what your grandfather demonstrated. I want to revamp our entire self-defense program, but I need someone who understands both the physical and philosophical aspects. Would you be willing to co-teach a class with me?" The idea thrilled and terrified Lucas in equal measure. "I'm just a freshman, coach," Do you really think? I think you understand something I've spent 15 years missing, Roberts interrupted. Age doesn't matter when you have real knowledge to share. They decided to start with a pilot program, a voluntary after-school class that would meet twice a week. Lucas spent his evenings with Steven, planning curriculum that would blend practical self-defense with the deeper principles of martial arts philosophy. Remember, Steven advised as they worked through lesson plans, the goal isn't to create fighters. It's to create people who understand their own strength and how to use it responsibly. The first class met on Wednesday afternoon in the renovated auxiliary gym. Lucas had expected maybe a dozen students, but 25 showed up, including several faces that surprised him. Jake Matthews was there, looking genuinely interested. The freshman girl who had asked the question at the assembly sat in the front row. Even some upperclassmen had come, drawn by curiosity about this new approach to self-defense. Before we learned any techniques, Lucas began, his initial nervousness fading as he settled into teaching mode. We need to understand what we're really studying. Martial arts isn't about becoming dangerous, it's about becoming safe. Safe for yourself and safe for others to be around. He demonstrated the basic principle that had started everything: awareness. The most important self-defense technique is situational awareness. Avoiding trouble is always better than fighting your way out of it. Coach Roberts watched from the sideline as Lucas guided the students through basic stances and breathing exercises. The transformation in both teacher and student was remarkable. Roberts found himself learning alongside the kids, approaching familiar movements from entirely new angles. Lucas called out a sophomore named Maria. What if someone's bigger and stronger than you? What if awareness isn't enough? Great question, Lucas replied, then gestured to Jake, who had become one of his most enthusiastic students. Jake, you're bigger than me. Try to grab my wrist like Coach Roberts did during that first demonstration. Jake stepped forward, his approach much more respectful than it would have been a week ago. He grasped Lucas's wrist firmly, but not aggressively. Now, watch what happens when I don't fight against his strength, but work with the energy he's giving me, Lucas said. He demonstrated the escape technique his grandfather had taught him, moving fluidly through the redirection until Jake found himself off balance, while Lucas remained centered. But here's the important part, Lucas continued. I'm not trying to hurt Jake or humiliate him. I'm just removing myself from a potentially dangerous situation. The goal is always de-escalation. The class progressed through basic techniques, but Lucas made sure to emphasize the philosophical foundation behind each movement. When they practiced blocks, he talked about protection rather than aggression. When they worked on redirection, he explained how understanding energy flow could apply to conflicts beyond physical confrontation. My grandfather always told me that martial arts is like learning a language, Lucas explained as the class wound down. The techniques are just vocabulary, but the real communication comes from understanding what you're trying to say. After the session, several students lingered to ask questions. The freshman girl, whose name was Emma, approached Lucas with obvious nervousness. I've been practicing what you showed us at the assembly, she said quietly. The breathing exercises and the confidence stance. It's helping with the bullying situation. How so? Lucas asked, genuinely interested. I'm not reacting the same way. I'm staying calmer, more centered, and somehow that's making them less interested in picking on me. It's like they can sense that I'm not afraid anymore. Lucas felt a warm surge of pride, not in himself, but in Emma's growth. That's exactly how it's supposed to work. When you're centered and confident, people respond to that energy differently. Jake waited until the other students had left before approaching. Hey Lucas, I owe you an apology. A real one. I was a complete jerk about your grandfather, and I was wrong about, well, about everything. You don't need to apologize, Lucas said. You were skeptical about something you didn't understand. That's normal. No, it was more than that, Jake insisted. I was threatened by the idea that there might be something I didn't know about strength and fighting. I've been the tough guy my whole life, and suddenly here you were showing me that being tough isn't the same as being strong. Lucas studied Jake's face, seeing genuine remorse and growth there. What matters is that you're open to learning now. That takes real courage. Coach Roberts joined them as they packed up the equipment. Lucas, that was incredible. I've been teaching self-defense for years, but I've never seen students respond like that. They're not just learning techniques, they're learning to think. differently about conflict. That's what my grandfather always emphasized, Lucas replied. The physical techniques are just tools. The real martial art is in how you think about using them. I want to expand this program, Robert said. Maybe we could offer it to the whole district. There are a lot of schools that could benefit from this approach. The idea of teaching beyond Jefferson High excited Lucas, but it also felt overwhelming. I'm still learning myself, coach. I don't know if I'm ready for something that big. You're ready, said a familiar voice from the doorway. Steven Seagal entered the gymnasium, having arrived to pick up Lucas. I watched the last few minutes of your class. You're a natural teacher. Grandpa, I was just sharing what you taught me. You were doing much more than that, Steven said. You were taking those lessons and making them your own, adapting them for your students' needs. That's not just teaching, that's mastery. As they drove home, Steven was unusually quiet. Finally, Lucas asked what he was thinking about. I'm thinking about legacy, Steven said. For years, I worried about how my work would be remembered. Would people understand that the movies were just entertainment? Would anyone remember the deeper principles I tried to represent? He glanced at Lucas with obvious pride. Watching you teach today, I realized I don't need to worry about that anymore. The real legacy isn't in the films or the fame. It's in you, Lucas. In the way you're carrying these principles forward and sharing them with others. Lucas felt a profound sense of responsibility and honor. I won't let you down, Grandpa. You couldn't, Steven said simply. You're already exceeding every expectation I ever had. You're taking what I taught you and making it better, more relevant, more accessible to young people. That's exactly what legacy is supposed to be, not preservation, but evolution. That night, Lucas lay in bed thinking about the day's class, about Emma's growing confidence, about Jake's transformation, about the possibility of teaching other students in other schools. For the first time in his life, he had a clear vision of his future, not as Steven Seagal's grandson trying to live up to an impossible standard, but as Lucas Seagal, teacher and student, carrying forward a tradition of wisdom and strength. The legacy was in good hands, and it was ready to grow. 3 weeks after the pilot program began, Lucas found himself sitting in Principal Wells's office alongside Steven and Coach Roberts, discussing something that would have seemed impossible a month earlier, the formal integration of their martial arts philosophy program into Jefferson High's curriculum. The response has been extraordinary, Principal Wells said, flipping through a folder of feedback forms. Parents are reporting improved confidence in their children. Teachers are noting better conflict resolution skills. And our disciplinary incidents have dropped by 30% since the program started. Lucas still felt surreal hearing adults discuss his teaching as if he were a professional educator rather than a 15-year-old who had stumbled into this role. But as he listened to the data, he realized that something genuinely meaningful was happening. What I find most remarkable, Coach Roberts added, is how the program is affecting students who aren't even enrolled in it. Word spreads, and suddenly kids are approaching conflicts differently throughout the school. That's the ripple effect, Steven observed. When you change how people think about strength and conflict, it influences everyone they interact with. That afternoon, Lucas had scheduled individual time with some of his students who were struggling with specific issues. Emma had made remarkable progress with her confidence, but she wanted to discuss something that went beyond physical self-defense. Lucas, she said as they sat in the quiet corner of the library he'd designated as his informal counseling space. I've been thinking about what you said about martial arts being a way of understanding yourself. But what if you don't like what you understand? The question caught Lucas off guard with its depth. What do you mean? I mean, as I've gotten more confident and less afraid, I've also gotten more aware of things about myself that I don't like. I'm more judgmental than I thought. I get angry more easily than I realized. It's like learning to be strong also means learning about your weaknesses. Lucas nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her observation. My grandfather told me once that true strength begins with honest self-assessment. You can't improve what you don't acknowledge. But it's uncomfortable, Emma said. Sometimes I think I was happier when I was just trying to survive each day instead of trying to understand who I really am. Do you remember what you felt like before you started training? Lucas asked. Emma considered this. Scared, powerless, like I was at the mercy of whatever other people decided to do to me. And now I feel capable, like I have choices. Like I can influence what happens to me instead of just reacting to it. So you're trading the comfort of ignorance for the power of knowledge, Lucas said. That's not an easy trade, but it's usually the right one. They talked for another half hour about the difference between strength and power, about how self-awareness could be uncomfortable but ultimately liberating. As Emma left, Lucas realized he'd been having the same internal dialogue himself. His next student was Jake, who had evolved from skeptic to enthusiast to something approaching a philosophical partner. Jake's questions always pushed Lucas to think more deeply about the principles he was teaching. "I've been wondering about something," Jake said as they walked to the auxiliary gym. All this emphasis on avoiding conflict, on de-escalation and redirection. What happens when you're facing someone who won't be redirected? Someone who's genuinely committed to violence? It was a question Lucas had been grappling with himself. "What do you think the answer is?" "I think there are times when you have to fight," Jake said. "Not because you want to, but because it's the only way to protect yourself or someone else." Lucas nodded. "My grandfather always said that a true martial artist is prepared for violence but hopes never to use it. The goal is to be so skilled in de-escalation that physical conflict becomes unnecessary. But if it does become necessary, then you end it as quickly and safely as possible," Jake finished. "With minimum force necessary to stop the threat." Exactly. But here's the important part. You never enjoy it. You never take pride in having to hurt someone, even in self-defense. The moment you start enjoying violence is the moment you've lost the path. As they practiced techniques, Lucas found himself thinking about the broader implications of what they were discussing. In a world that often glorified aggression and celebrated dominance, teaching young people to find strength in restraint was almost revolutionary. That evening, Lucas and Steven sat on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. It had become their tradition, these quiet conversations that helped Lucas process what he was learning and teaching. "I've been thinking about what you said about legacy," Lucas said, "about how it's supposed to evolve, not just be preserved." "What about it?" "I'm starting to understand that the legacy isn't really about martial arts techniques or even philosophy. It's about helping people become the best versions of themselves." Steven smiled. "Go on." "Emma is becoming more confident and self-aware. Jake is learning to question his assumptions about strength. Even Coach Roberts is rethinking how he approaches teaching. The martial arts are just the vehicle. The real destination is personal growth." "That's a profound realization," Steven said. "It took me decades to understand that. You're getting there much faster." "Because I have a good teacher," Lucas said with a grin. "You have good instincts," Steven corrected. "And more importantly, you care about your students as people, not just as vessels for knowledge. That's what makes a teacher great." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Lucas spoke again. "Grandpa, do you ever worry that I'm too young for this responsibility? That I'm teaching things I haven't lived long enough to fully understand?" Steven turned to look at his grandson, his expression serious. "Lucas, wisdom isn't about age. It's about the quality of your attention and the depth of your compassion. You pay attention to your students in a way that many adults never learn to do. You care about their growth more than your own recognition. Those qualities matter more than years of experience. But what if I give someone bad advice? What if I'm wrong about something important? Then you'll learn from the mistake, and you'll be a better teacher for it," Steven said simply. "The goal isn't to be perfect, Lucas. It's to be genuine. Your students connect with you because they can see that you're on the same journey they are, trying to understand yourself, trying to grow, trying to become who you're meant to be." Lucas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd been carrying the pressure of trying to live up to his grandfather's reputation, trying to be worthy of the trust his students placed in him. But Steven was right. Authenticity mattered more than perfection. "I love teaching," Lucas said, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "I love seeing people discover their own strength. I love helping them understand that they have more power over their lives than they thought." "Then you've found your calling," Steven said. "Most people spend their whole lives searching for work that feels meaningful. You're 15 years old, and you've already discovered yours." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lucas felt a deep sense of gratitude for his grandfather's teachings, for the opportunity to share them, and for the students who trusted him enough to learn. The legacy wasn't a burden to carry, it was a gift to give, and he was just getting started. 6 months after Steven Seagal had walked into Jefferson High's gymnasium, Lucas stood before the monthly school board meeting, preparing to present a proposal that would have seemed impossible back when he was just a nervous freshman trying to convince his classmates that his grandfather was real. The pilot program had exceeded every expectation. Not only had Jefferson High's disciplinary issues decreased significantly, but test scores had improved as students developed better focus and self-control. The program had attracted attention from educators across the district, and now Lucas found himself at the center of discussions about expanding the curriculum to other schools. The Integrated Martial Arts Philosophy program, Lucas read from his prepared notes, isn't just about self-defense. It's about giving students tools for emotional regulation, conflict resolution, and personal development that they'll use for the rest of their lives. He looked up from his papers to see a room full of adults listening intently to his words. School board members, principals from other districts, and even a representative from the state education department were present. The teenager who had once doubted his own worth was now being asked to advise educational policy. We've documented improvements in academic performance, reductions in bullying incidents, and increased reports of student confidence and well-being. Lucas continued. But the most important change is something harder to measure. Students are learning to see strength as something that builds others up rather than tears them down. After his presentation, the questions came fast and thoughtful. How could they train other instructors? What would the budget requirements be? How could they ensure consistent quality across different schools? Lucas answered each question with the confidence that came from months of practical experience. But when Dr. Patricia Henderson, the district superintendent, asked about his long-term vision for the program, Lucas paused thoughtfully. I see a generation of young people who understand. That real power comes from understanding yourself and caring about others, he said. Students who approach conflicts with wisdom instead of aggression, who see differences as opportunities to learn rather than threats to overcome. The board voted unanimously to approve a pilot expansion to 3 additional schools, with Lucas serving as the primary consultant for program development and instructor training. After the meeting, Lucas found himself in the parking lot with Steven, Coach Roberts, and Principal Wells, all of them still processing what had just happened. I'm proud of you, son, Coach Roberts said, and Lucas realized the older man had become something of a mentor himself. 6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about teaching self-defense. You've taught me that I didn't know anything about teaching self-development. We've all learned from each other, Lucas replied. That's what makes this work. Nobody has all the answers, but together we can figure out the important questions. Principal Wells shook her head in amazement. Lucas, when this started, I thought we were just dealing with a family dispute that got out of hand. I never imagined it would lead to educational innovation. Sometimes the best discoveries happen by accident, Steven observed. Lucas didn't set out to become an educational reformer. He just wanted to share something he loved with people who needed it. As they prepared to leave, Coach Roberts pulled Lucas aside. I have something to tell you. I've been offered a position as athletic director at the high school level. It would mean giving up teaching. Lucas felt a stab of concern. Coach, the program needs you. You bring the practical experience I don't have yet. The program needs leadership, Roberts corrected. And you're ready to provide that. I'll still be involved as an advisor, but it's time for you to step into the primary instructor role. The idea both thrilled and terrified Lucas. Leading a single pilot program was one thing, but becoming the primary instructor for a district-wide initiative felt enormous. That evening, as Lucas and Steven worked through forms in the backyard, a practice that had become sacred time for both of them, Lucas voiced his concerns. Am I really ready to lead something this big? What if I'm not good enough to carry the program forward? Steven finished a complex sequence of movements before answering. Lucas, do you remember what you felt like 6 months ago? Confused, angry, like I didn't know who I was supposed to be. And now, Lucas considered the question as he moved through his own form, each technique flowing naturally into the next. Now I feel centered, like I know what I'm supposed to be doing with my life, like I have something valuable to offer. That transformation, from confusion to clarity, from anger to peace, from self-doubt to self-knowledge, that's what you're offering your students. You're not just teaching them martial arts techniques. You're showing them a path to becoming who they're meant to be. But what if I make mistakes? You will make mistakes, Steven said matter-of-factly. That's how you'll learn. The goal isn't to be perfect, it's to be authentic and committed to growth. As they finished their practice, Lucas felt the familiar sense of peace that came from aligning his actions with his deepest values. Teaching martial arts philosophy wasn't just his job, it was his calling. 3 months later, Lucas stood in the gymnasium of Roosevelt Middle School, watching 25 seventh graders attempt their first coordinated form. Some moved with natural grace. Others struggled with basic coordination, but all of them were learning the same fundamental lesson: that strength came from within, that power was meant to serve others, and that the greatest victories were often achieved without fighting at all. In the back of the room, Emma, now a sophomore and Lucas's assistant instructor, helped a struggling student with his stance. Jake, who had become something of a co-teacher, was working with a group on breathing techniques. Coach Roberts, true to his word, observed from the sidelines in his new role as district athletic coordinator, taking notes on program implementation that would be shared with other schools in the expansion. As Lucas watched his students progress through movements that had once seemed impossible to them, he thought about legacy and how it really worked. It wasn't about preserving something unchanged. It was about taking something valuable and helping it grow, adapt, and serve new generations. His grandfather had given him martial arts techniques, but more importantly, he had given him the understanding that true strength was meant to be shared. Steven had taught him that the greatest martial artists were teachers, and that the greatest teachers were servants of their students' growth. Now Lucas was passing that gift forward, watching young people discover their own strength, their own wisdom, their own capacity to make the world a little bit better. The legacy lived on, not as a monument to the past, but as a bridge to the future. And Lucas Seagal, once a confused freshman trying to prove his worth, had become exactly who he was meant to be: a teacher, a guide, and a guardian of wisdom that would outlive them all. In the end, that was what legacy really meant: not the preservation of one person's achievements, but the multiplication of human potential across generations. Steven Seagal's greatest role hadn't been in any movie. It had been as a grandfather who taught his grandson that true strength comes from lifting others up. And that story was just beginning. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.